I reached him before my nerve could catch up and talk me out of it. You look like you need a distraction. The words came out steadier than I felt. My heart was doing something violent behind my ribs. I'll have you groaning tonight. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man caught off guard. It was the silence of a man deciding. He turned slowly, the way people do when they already know what they'll find, and aren't particularly impressed by it. His eyes moved over me once, unhurried, clinical. Not the way men usually looked at a woman in a red dress. The way a chess player looks at a piece that has just moved itself onto the wrong square. He set his glass down. The bartender stopped mid-pour. The couple 3 stools down went quiet without knowing why. Even the low jazz seemed to hesitate. Interesting choice of words, he said. His voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't need volume. My smile held. But something cold had begun its slow crawl up my spine, the belated, bone-deep understanding that I had not caught anyone's attention tonight. I had triggered something. He didn't ask me to follow him. He simply stood, adjusted the single button of his jacket with one unhurried movement, and walked toward the exit. The message was clear in the set of his shoulders, the absence of a backward glance. He had decided, and the only question remaining was whether I would be sensible or stupid. I followed him. I told myself it was curiosity. The dress, the dare, the week I'd survived, all of it adding up to one reckless equation. I told myself I could turn back at any moment, that the door behind me was still the same door, that nothing had technically changed. I was already lying to myself, and I'd only taken 12 steps. The lobby of Noir and Guilt was all dark marble and low amber light, the kind of space designed to make ordinary people feel significant. He moved through it without acknowledging it, the way you stop noticing a room you own. I kept pace 3 steps behind, my heels barely audible against the stone floor, my pulse considerably louder. That's when I noticed the first one. A man near the elevator bank. Broad, still, dressed well enough to blend, but not moving toward anything. Not waiting for anyone. Just positioned. His eyes tracked our path with the quiet efficiency of someone running a calculation, not watching a scene. When my gaze snagged on his, he didn't look away. He looked through me, the way you look through furniture. I glanced left. Another one, near the concierge desk. Same stillness. Same quality of attention, present without being obvious, watchful without watching. My steps slowed almost imperceptibly. By the time we reached the revolving door, I had counted 4 of them. For men who hadn't been drinking, hadn't been talking, hadn't been doing any of the things people do inside a hotel bar at 11 on a Friday night. They had simply been waiting, and now, one by one, without signal or word, they were moving. Not toward the exit. Around it. Outside it. Ahead of us. The night air hit me as I stepped onto the pavement, carrying the faint bite of a city that never fully cooled down. A black car, long, quiet, the kind without a visible badge, sat directly at the curb. Not parked. Stationed. The driver didn't look up. He already knew. I don't remember agreeing to leave, I said. He turned then. For the first time since the bar, he gave me his full attention, and I understood immediately why I'd sought it and why I should have left it alone. Up close, in the unforgiving spill of streetlight, he was even more unsettling, not because of the ink at his throat or the immaculate architecture of his face, but because of the absolute absence of uncertainty in his eyes. Most people, even powerful ones, carry some small residue of doubt. A flicker. A hedge. There was none of that here. You didn't agree, he said. You followed. I was curious. You were reckless. A pause, not unkind, but precise. There's a difference. Curious people ask questions before they move. Reckless people move and call it curiosity afterward. I opened my mouth. Closed it. Hated that he was right. Who are you? I asked instead. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth, exactly, but the closest approximation he seemed to allow. He reached into his jacket and produced a card, plain matte black, a single name embossed in silver so understated you had to tilt it toward the light to read it. Osiris Thorn. No title. No company. No number. Just the name, as though the name was sufficient, as though anyone who needed further context had no business having it. The card tells me nothing, I said. I know. Behind me, I heard the soft displacement of air that meant someone had taken up a position close to my left shoulder. I didn't turn around immediately. Some instinct, new, raw, and apparently activated by mortal proximity to whatever this man was, told me that turning around quickly would look like panic, and panic, I was beginning to understand, was not a useful currency here. I turned slowly. The man from the elevator bank stood 4 feet away. Not threatening. Not touching. Simply there, the way a wall is simply there, structural, immovable, not hostile but absolutely not optional. Are they yours? I asked quietly. Yes. All of them. All of them. I breathed through the information. The bar, the stillness, the way the room had reorganized itself around his departure without a single spoken instruction. The car that had known to be here. The men who had moved like water finding its predetermined level. I made a very stupid joke to a very dangerous man, I said, not quite to him. More to the universe, by way of inventory. You made a provocative statement to a man who hasn't been provoked in a long time. He studied me with that same unhurried assessment from the bar. That's rarer than you'd think. I'm not sure that's a compliment. It isn't. Get in the car, Miss Belen. I squared my shoulders, because it was the only armor I had left. Lumi Belen. And I'm not getting into a car with a man whose last name sounds like a mythology exam question and who travels with a small private army. The man behind me made a sound. Low, almost inaudible. I couldn't tell if it was amusement or the prelude to something less pleasant. Osiris Thorn, however, looked at me the way you look at something unexpected, not warmly, but with a new quality of focus, as if a variable had shifted in an equation he thought he'd already solved. Someone spoke to my associate this evening, he said. Before you approached me. Took a photograph. Asked questions about my schedule. The words were measured, neutral, the way you are neutral about things that have already been decided. You were seen with me. Which means you've been seen. The cold from the pavement climbed through the soles of my shoes. I don't know anything about your schedule, I said. I don't know anything about you at all. I came here because I needed one night of being something other than invisible, and you were the most interesting thing in the room and I made a terrible decision, and I would genuinely like to go home now. He watched me for a long moment. Long enough that I became acutely aware of the 4 men, the car, the door I couldn't go back through, the name on the card still in my hand. I know, he said finally. That's the problem. He opened the car door himself. Not aggressively. Not as a threat. With the particular economy of a man who had already run the calculations and arrived at the only available conclusion. You'll be safer with me tonight than without me, he said. That isn't a boast. It's arithmetic. I looked at the open door. At him. At the city behind me, suddenly feeling very large and very indifferent. I got in the car. And the door closed with the soft, definitive sound of a life dividing itself into before and after. The drive took 40 minutes. I knew this because I counted. It was the only useful thing I could do with my hands folded in my lap and the city unreeling outside tinted glass that turned every streetlight into something amber and distant and slightly unreal. The men in the front, driver, passenger, did not speak. Did not glance back. existed with the same quality of deliberate invisibility as furniture that had learned to breathe. Osiris sat beside me with 3 inches of charged space between us and said nothing at all. I had approximately 9,000 things I wanted to say. I said none of them. Partly because I was still running the arithmetic of the evening, the bar, the card, you've been seen, and partly because something in the quality of his silence suggested it wasn't absence. It was a thing he did on purpose. A room he could inhabit without apology, the way some people can sit with music and others require it. I watched the city thin out. Watched the lights grow fewer and more deliberate. Watched the road lift slightly as we moved through gates I only registered in retrospect, tall, black, the kind that don't announce themselves because they don't need to. Then the house. I had expected security. I had not expected beauty. It sat back from a long pale driveway like something that had decided centuries ago exactly where it belonged and had never been given reason to reconsider. Stone and dark glass, 3 stories, the upper windows lit with that particular quality of warm interior light that means old money and no apology for it. Grounds that disappeared into the dark beyond the reach of the entrance lamps. Somewhere to the left, water, a fountain, or something larger, I couldn't tell, made the kind of sound that costs a great deal to maintain. The car stopped. A door opened from outside before I could reach the handle. I stepped out and tilted my head back and looked up at the facade, and the facade looked back with magnificent indifference. You live here, I said. Yes. Alone. A pause that managed to contain an entire economy of things he chose not to say. Come inside, Miss Belen. Inside was worse. Worse meaning more, meaning the kind of interior that doesn't perform wealth, it simply is it, with the effortlessness of something that has never needed to perform anything. Dark hardwood underfoot, warm enough to have history. Ceilings that had earned their height. Art on the walls that I couldn't identify but could feel in the way you feel a piece of music that's slightly above your current ability to name. You know it's significant before you understand why. A woman appeared from a corridor to the left. 60, perhaps, with the bearing of someone who had long ago decided the world could come to her. She looked at me with the particular assessment of a person who has seen many things arrive through that door and has learned to classify them quickly. Mrs. Adiz, Osiris said, this is Lumi Belen. She'll need the east wing. Of course. Mrs. Adiz's gaze moved over my red dress, my bare arms, my complete absence of luggage, and to her enormous credit, her expression registered none of it. Are you hungry, Miss Belen? I realized, distantly, that I was. That I had been so busy being terrified and reckless that I had entirely forgotten about dinner. Yes, actually. I'll have something sent up. She disappeared as quietly as she'd arrived, and I turned to find Osiris watching me with that same calibrated attention, hands in his pockets now, jacket still immaculate despite the hour, despite the evening, despite whatever machinery of danger had apparently been turning behind the scenes of what I'd taken for an ordinary Friday night. The East Wing, I said. That's a sentence people use in this house. It has a private sitting room and a bathroom with a lock you control. He said it plainly, without the performance of reassurance. Just facts, delivered like floor plans. No one will enter without your permission. Except you. I won't enter at all. I studied him. Tried to find the angle in it, the manipulation, the performance, the thing men say when they want you to lower your guard so they can do the thing they said they wouldn't. I was good at reading people. It was, professionally speaking, the only consistent skill I'd retained across a career of positioning other people's ideas and making them legible to the world. I couldn't read him. Which was either a testament to his discipline or a warning I was choosing not to hear loudly enough. You said I'd been seen, I said. What does that mean, exactly? Seen by whom? Seen as what? He moved to a low console table near the window and poured 2 glasses of water from a heavy crystal decanter, not alcohol, just water, which for some reason I found more unsettling than if he'd poured something stronger. He handed me one. I took it. There are people, he said, who monitor my movements. My associations. They are not law enforcement. A pause. They are less patient than law enforcement and considerably less bound by procedure. When you approached me tonight, you became, visually, on record, someone connected to me. I'm not connected to you. I was flirting badly at a bar. That distinction matters to you and to me. He looked at me steadily. It does not matter to them. The water was cold. I held the glass with both hands because it gave me something to do with the information settling like sediment through my chest. So what happens now? I said. Now you sleep. In the morning, when I have more information about what was photographed and by whom, we discuss next steps. Next steps, I repeated. As though this is a project brief. Something moved at the edge of his expression. Almost amusement. Almost. Would you prefer a different framework? I'd prefer to have stayed home. Yes, he said, simply. I imagine you would. Mrs. Adiz reappeared at the base of the staircase, silently, the way this house seemed to do everything, and tilted her head toward the upper floor with an invitation so elegant it barely qualified as a gesture. I looked once more at Osiris Thorne, standing in the amber light of his enormous, beautiful, quietly lethal home, watching me with eyes that had already calculated 17 things I hadn't thought of yet. If I'm in danger, I said, why do you seem so unbothered by it? The almost amusement settled into something steadier. Something that might, in another life, have been the beginning of respect. Because danger, he said, is the only environment I've ever known how to manage. I followed Mrs. Adiz up the stairs. Behind me, I heard nothing. No movement, no further words. Just the deep, expensive silence of a house that had housed secrets for a very long time and had learned, like its owner, to carry them without strain. I did not sleep for a long time. But the lock on the east wing door worked exactly as he'd said it would. I checked it twice. Then a third time, not because I doubted him, which was, perhaps, the most frightening thing of all. Morning arrived through curtains I hadn't closed properly, laying a thin blade of light across the floor of a room that was nicer than any place I'd ever slept and more disorienting for it. For approximately 4 seconds, I didn't remember. Then I did. I sat up in sheets that cost more than my last month's rent and took a careful inventory of my situation. Red dress folded over a chair, Mrs. Adiz doing, sometime in the night, replaced by a set of clothes in my approximate size that raised their own questions. A tray on the side table with coffee, still warm, and a small card that read breakfast downstairs when ready in handwriting so controlled it looked typeset. I showered. Changed. Spent 2 minutes in the mirror talking myself into a posture that said I woke up in strangers' estates all the time and found it mildly inconvenient at worst. Then I went downstairs to hear whatever it was Osiris Thorne had decided to say to me. He was in a room off the main hall, study, or something close to it, the kind of room that had always been a study and intended to remain one regardless of anyone's opinion. Bookshelves floor to ceiling, a desk that bore the particular organized weight of real work rather than performed industry, and 2 chairs angled toward each other near the window with the deliberate geometry of a conversation that had already been planned. He was standing when I entered. Dark shirt, no jacket, sleeves rolled to the forearm. It was the most undone I'd seen him, and it made him look, if anything, more formidable, as though the suit had been the concession to the world and this was the thing underneath it. Coffee, he said. I had some. Thank you. I sat in the nearer chair without being invited to, because waiting to be invited felt like a form of surrender I couldn't afford at 8 in the morning. You said we'd discuss next steps. He sat across from me. Set a folder on the side table between us, slim, dark, closed. Didn't open it yet. The man who photographed us last night, he began, works for a faction currently negotiating a territorial dispute with my organization. They have been looking for leverage. A pause, precise and deliberate. They found some. I'm not leverage. I'm a digital strategist from a 2-bedroom flat who got fired on a Wednesday. You are a woman who was photographed in intimate proximity to me at 11 on a Friday evening, who then left with me, who did not return home. He said it without inflection, which made it worse. What you are to yourself is immaterial to what you become in someone else's narrative. I sat with that. The particular indignity of it, that my presence in someone's story could be weaponized before I'd even been given the courtesy of a speaking role. So they think I'm, what? Significant to you. They think you may be. That uncertainty is enough to make you useful to them. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, and for the first time I had the sense of the full weight of his focus directed not at assessing me but at something else, something he was choosing how to say. Which gives us an opportunity. There it was. The word that never arrived without cargo. I need a traitor identified, he said. Someone inside my organization has been providing information to this faction. Schedules, meeting locations, the names of associates. The leak is recent, within the last 6 weeks, and it is someone with enough access to do significant damage. He paused. I have narrowed it to 4 people. To draw them out, I need a variable they haven't planned for. Something new in my life that changes the calculus. Something they'll move to either exploit or eliminate. I could hear the shape of it arriving before he said it. No, I said. I haven't asked yet. You're about to ask me to pretend to be something I'm not, in proximity to people who apparently photograph strangers in bars as a professional courtesy, in an environment where the stakes are, I gestured at the room, the house, the weight of everything it implied, whatever all of this is. And the answer is no. He opened the folder. Inside was a photograph, clear, close, unmistakably me and unmistakably him, my hand near his arm at the bar, his face angled toward mine. The framing was intimate in the way that cameras make things intimate whether or not they were. Beneath it, a printed page of text I didn't need to read closely to understand. Names. My name. My address. My last address and my new one. The new one I'd only moved to 3 weeks ago. The room was very quiet. They are already building a file, he said. Not unkindly. Just accurately. Whether you participate in what I'm proposing or not, that file exists. The difference is whether you have protection while it does. I looked at the photograph for a long moment. At the version of myself who had walked into a bar in a red dress and decided to be brave for one evening and had, in doing so, handed a faction of organized criminals her home address. What exactly are you proposing? I said. My voice came out steadier than I deserved. 1 week. You would be presented as my fiancé at 2, possibly 3 social engagements, environments where my inner circle will be present, where the traitor will have opportunity to observe you, make contact with their handlers, and in doing so, reveal themselves. He held my gaze. You would be coached. Protected at all times. Compensated. Compensated, I repeated. The word sat strangely in the room. Enough to replace what you lost. And more. I stood up. Crossed to the window because I needed to put space between myself and the folder, the photograph, the neat terrible logic of everything he was laying out. The grounds outside were immaculate in the morning light, hedged, geometric, a gardener moving somewhere in the far distance with the unhurried patience of someone whose work existed outside the urgency of other people's crises. If I say no, I said to the window. I have you taken home with a security detail for the week. It is less elegant and less effective, but it's available. And the traitor remains unidentified. For now. A beat. Problems that remain unidentified have a tendency to resolve themselves in ways that are inconvenient for everyone adjacent to them. I turned around. He was watching me with that same quality of patience, not the patience of someone waiting for you to agree, but the patience of someone who has already accepted every possible answer and prepared for each one. If I say yes, I said, I need rules. Actual rules. Written down, if necessary. Reasonable. I need to know everything that's expected of me before I walk into any room. Agreed. And if at any point I decide it's too much, you say so and it stops. He said it without hesitation, which was the first thing he'd said in 2 days that I believed completely, instinctively, without needing to examine it for angles. I looked at him. At the folder. At the life I'd had 72 hours ago versus the life apparently assembling itself around me whether I consented to it or not. 1 week, I said. 1 week. I sat back down. Picked up the cold coffee because my hands needed something to hold. And tried not to think about the fact that I had just agreed to become, however temporarily, the most visible person in the orbit of the most dangerous man I had ever met. The gardener outside moved slowly between the hedges, utterly unbothered. I envied him unreasonably. The training began the same afternoon, which told me everything about how Osiris Thorne operated. No settling period. No gradual acclimatization. You agreed to a thing and the thing began immediately, because time was a resource and sentiment was not. The first lessons were not what I expected. I had anticipated, in the abstract, Hollywood-informed way of someone who had never been closer to organized crime than a streaming subscription, some kind of tactical briefing. Maps, perhaps. Photographs of dangerous men with aliases printed beneath them. Certainly not a 3-hour seminar on table etiquette, conversational architecture, and what he called the grammar of rooms. You read people, he said, on the first pass through the formal dining room, hands behind his back, moving with the measured pace of someone who had given this particular lesson before. You said so last night. A digital strategist, you build narratives for other people. I built narratives. Past tense. I'm currently unemployed. The skill doesn't expire with the contract. He stopped at the head of the table. In these environments, conversation is not exchange. It is positioning. Every question is a probe for weakness. Every compliment is a transaction with a deferred invoice. You will be watched not for what you say but for what you reveal without meaning to. I pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited, partly to test whether it bothered him. It didn't. And what do I usually reveal? He looked at me with that calibrated gaze. That you're intelligent and know it, which makes you underestimate rooms that are also intelligent and know it. That you deflect with humor when you're afraid. That you reach for your left wrist when you're working something out, a watch habit, I assume, or a former one. I looked down. My left hand was resting on the table. I moved it. You've been watching me, I said. I watch everyone. He said it without apology, the way you state a weather condition. In my world, observation is not a courtesy. It is survival. You'll need to learn the same. By evening, we had covered the social geography of the engagements ahead, who would be present, what their relationships to Osiris were, which alliances were solid and which were load-bearing in the way of old infrastructure, maintained not from strength but from the mutual inconvenience of collapse. He spoke about these people with the flat familiarity of a man describing a chessboard he'd been playing for years. No warmth. No contempt. Just precision. I absorbed it. Cross-referenced it. Built internal maps of allegiance and rivalry that I formatted, privately, like stakeholder documents, because apparently you could take the strategist out of the career but the career's muscle memory was considerably more stubborn. He noticed. Of course he noticed. You're categorizing them, he said. By relationship type and threat level, yes. It helps me hold the information. Something shifted fractionally in his expression. That movement I was beginning to catalog, the one that wasn't quite approval but lived in the same neighborhood. Good. The weapons lesson happened on the second day, in a room I would not have found on my own, lower level, access through a door in the study that looked precisely like a wall panel and behaved exactly like one until Osiris pressed a specific point in the molding and it exhaled open with the soft pneumatic sigh of serious engineering. The room beyond was long, low-lit, climate-controlled in the way that suggested what was stored here mattered. A range at the far end. Cases along the walls with the quiet authority of a serious collection rather than a display. The air smelled of gun oil and something mineral, cold, ancient. I stopped in the doorway. "I'm not going to shoot anyone," I said. "No. But you need to understand the weight of one. How to hold it without flinching. How to appear familiar without being dangerous." He crossed to one of the cases, opened it with a small key from his pocket, and removed a handgun, compact, matte black, which he checked with the automatic efficiency of someone for whom the sequence was so embedded it required no conscious thought. He set it on the table in the center of the room. In these rooms, people read hands. If you're handed something and you recoil, it marks you. I approached the table. Looked at it. The gun looked back with the particular blankness of objects that have accumulated history. "Pick it up," he said. I did. It was heavier than I expected, heavier in a way that wasn't just physical, that carried some additional weight of significance I couldn't entirely name. I held it the way I thought you were supposed to, which was apparently wrong. He moved behind me. "Grip here." His hand covered mine and adjusted, thumb repositioned, fingers redistributed, with the impersonal efficiency of a flight instructor correcting your hands on a yoke. Clinical. Instructional. I told myself that was all it was. You're fighting the weight. Stop fighting it. Let it settle. Easy for you to say. Both hands. Left supports, right controls. There. His voice was close, closer than the lesson technically required, though the lesson technically required him to be close, which was a distinction I was arguing with myself about while also trying to focus on not dropping a firearm. "Now, look at the target. Not at your hands. Your hands know where they are. My hands have never touched one of these before. Your hands are learning. Trust them." I looked at the target. Breathed. The weight redistributed itself, imperceptibly, into something that felt, not comfortable, but held. Intentional. "There," he said again. He didn't move immediately. That was the thing. The correction was complete, I was holding it correctly, he had achieved the instructional goal, there was no technical reason for him to remain where he was, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him along my back, close enough that his voice when he spoke arrived at my ear rather than across a room. He remained anyway. For 3 seconds, I counted them, later, with the obsessive precision of someone trying to understand a thing by measuring it, and in those 3 seconds the air between us underwent a shift of atmospheric pressure I felt in my sternum. Then he stepped back. The distance reasserted itself with the decisive snap of a ruled line. "Again," he said, from across the room now, as though the 3 seconds had been a technical error he'd already corrected. I reset. Raised the weapon. Breathed. We ran the drill 6 more times. He corrected my stance twice, both times briefly, both times with the same deliberate efficiency that I studied very carefully for any recurrence of those 3 seconds and found none. Which was professionally appropriate and personally maddening in ways I was not yet ready to examine directly. Afterward, he locked the case. I set the gun down and shook out my hands, not from strain but from the particular residue of sustained concentration. "You're a fast learner," he said. Not warmly. Just factually. I had good material to work with, I said, and meant the lesson, and suspected we both knew I didn't entirely mean the lesson. He looked at me for 1 beat longer than necessary. Then he turned and walked back through the wall, and the panel exhaled closed behind him, and I stood alone in a room full of locked cases and took several long, slow breaths that had very little to do with the firearms. It happened on the 3rd day, and I was not supposed to see it. That much was clear afterward, in the way the house rearranged itself around the incident, in the way Mrs. Adiz appeared at my elbow 40 minutes too late with tea and a particular quality of deliberate calm that told me she was very good at arriving after things had resolved and presenting it as coincidence. The machinery of Osiris Thorne's household had protocols for most things. I had simply moved through the wrong corridor at the wrong moment and fallen outside the protocol's radius. I'd been restless. 3 days of structured learning and careful meals and the particular low-grade tension of living in proximity to a man who occupied every room he entered without apparently trying, it had compressed into a knot between my shoulder blades that no amount of pacing the east wing was going to loosen. So I'd gone downstairs at a time I hadn't announced, through a route I hadn't previously used, following the half-remembered geography of a house I was still mapping. The corridor that ran behind the main study led out near a second sitting room I'd assumed was ceremonial, too formally arranged to be functional, the kind of room that existed to impress rather than inhabit. I had been wrong about that. I heard the voices first. 2 of them, one of which was Osiris, low, flat, stripped of the measured patience he deployed in my company and revealing something underneath that patience, something that had always been there the way structural steel is always there inside a wall. The other voice I didn't recognize. It was doing most of the talking, which meant it was doing most of the explaining, which in the context of that tone and that room meant it was doing most of the desperate bargaining. I should have retreated. Every sensible instinct I developed across 3 days of underworld grammar lessons said, turn around, find a different route, add this moment to the growing list of things you understand only in outline and are better off keeping that way. I stopped walking instead. Through the gap where the door had been left open, not carelessly, I would later understand, but because Osiris had known exactly who was in the house and had not anticipated me in this corridor at this hour, I could see the room in partial profile. A man in a chair, not restrained but somehow immovable regardless, with the particular stillness of someone who has understood the full scope of their situation and stopped spending energy on exits. He was well dressed. Mid-40s. The kind of face that probably projected reliability in other contexts. Not in this one. Osiris stood. Jacket off, sleeves rolled as had become characteristic of his working hours, and his back was partially to me so that what I could read was posture and the quality of the silence he was generating, and that silence had an entirely different texture than the ones I'd catalogued across our lessons. Those were considered architectural, built for effect. This one was load-bearing. It held something in place through sheer compression. He said something I couldn't fully hear. The man in the chair responded, short, placating. Osiris said something else, quieter this time, which was worse, and I knew it was worse in my bones before I processed why, and the man's composure disassembled itself in real time, that professional effect dropping away in pieces to expose something raw and animal and genuinely afraid beneath it. Osiris reached out and picked up a glass from the side table with complete unhurriedness and held it for a moment and then set it back down, and the gesture contained a violence that never became one, and that was somehow the most frightening thing I had witnessed in 30 years of living. I must have made a sound. Or moved. Something peripheral. Because he turned. Our eyes met through the gap in the door, and for a suspended, frameless second I was simply visible, caught, present, holding the full weight of something I wasn't meant to see. His expression didn't change. That was the worst of it. There was no surprise, no flicker of concern about what I'd witnessed. Just that clean, level acknowledgement of a new variable, assessed and filed, all in the span of a breath. He said something to the man in the chair without breaking eye contact with me. Brief, decisive. One of the silent men I'd long since accepted as fixtures materialized from the room's other entrance, and then I was looking at a closing door and my own reflection in the dark glass of a picture frame on the opposite wall. I walked back to the east wing. Sat on the edge of the bed. Examined my hands. He knocked 20 minutes later. "Come in," I said, because the lock was mine to control and I'd chosen not to use it, which was its own kind of statement that I hadn't fully reasoned through. He entered and remained near the door, which I recognized now as a spatial courtesy, keeping himself at a distance calibrated to give me room to process rather than perform. He'd done it in the study too, when the information was heavy. I'd filed it under tactics. I was no longer certain the filing was accurate. "You're going to tell me that wasn't what it looked like," I said. "No." He said it immediately, without padding. "It was exactly what it looked like." I nodded slowly. "The man in the chair. Someone who has been selling schedules to the faction we discussed. Not our trader, a peripheral courier." He was given the opportunity to explain himself. "And did he?" "Adequately." He paused. "He won't repeat the behavior." I looked at him. At the absolute absence of performance in his face, no justification, no softening, no recruitment of my sympathy to buffer the facts from their own weight. Just the facts, offered plainly, as they were, without apology and without embellishment. It terrified me. I want to be honest about that. It sat in my chest like cold water and I could not reason it away or reframe it into something manageable. And beneath it, coexisting with it in a way I found profoundly inconvenient, was something else entirely. Because most people lie about what they are. They construct elaborate architectures of justification and present them as character, and you spend years navigating the gap between the construction and the thing underneath. Osiris Thorne had shown me the thing underneath without dressing it, without asking me to forgive it, without performing remorse he didn't feel. There was a brutal, uncomfortable integrity to that. "Are you afraid of me?" he said. Not taunting. Genuinely asking, the way you ask about a structural condition because the answer determines what's possible. I considered lying. Considered the various diplomatic arrangements of the truth that would give me something to hide behind. "Yes," I said. "And I'm annoyed that it isn't the only thing I am." Something happened in his face then, not the almost amusement I'd catalogued, not the fractional approval. Something older and less defended than either of those, arriving and departing so quickly I might have constructed it from wishful thinking. He looked at me for a long moment. "Get some sleep, Miss Belen." "Lumi," I said. "If I'm wearing your ring in 4 days, you should probably manage my first name." The corner of his mouth moved. "Just barely. Just once. Get some sleep, Lumi." He left. I listened to his footsteps diminish down the corridor and told myself the warmth in my chest was simply relief that the conversation was over. I was becoming quite fluent, it turned out, in lying to myself. The dress was not red this time. It was midnight blue, backless to a degree that required a specific kind of confidence I spent 40 minutes constructing in the mirror, and it had been chosen, by Osiris, through Mrs. Adiz, through the quiet logistics of a household that anticipated needs before they were spoken, with the particular intention of making me look like a woman who had always lived in rooms like the one we were about to enter. Expensive but not trying. Beautiful but not performing it. A woman, in other words, entirely unlike what I actually was. I met him at the bottom of the stairs at 7, and he looked at me with the focused, technical assessment of a man confirming a resource was deployment ready, which was not romantic and which I reminded myself was entirely appropriate given the circumstances, and which worked as a reminder for approximately 4 seconds before his gaze settled and something in it shifted to a register I hadn't catalogued yet. "You'll do," he said. High praise. "In this context," he said, and offered his arm, "it is." The dinner was held at a private residence 40 minutes north, a man named Castle Vane, who Osiris had described during our preparations with the same flat precision he applied to everything, mid-tier operator, regional influence, currently cultivating ambitions that exceeded his infrastructure. Vane had requested the dinner. That request, Osiris had explained, was itself information, an attempt to take the measure of things since the photograph had circulated, to see what shape the situation had taken. What Vane didn't know was that one of his senior men was on our list of 4. What neither of them knew was that I would be leaving a listening device in Vane's private study before the evening was over. "The study is on the ground floor," Osiris had said, during the briefing that morning. "East side of the house." Vane steps away from dinner twice, once around the first course to take a standing call, once near dessert to check on the kitchen, a domestic habit his staff find endearing. The second window is yours. And if someone follows me, they won't. You'll have given them sufficient reason not to. He had looked at me with that level gaze. You told me you wanted to be seen. Tonight you will be. Thoroughly. I had understood what he meant. I had not entirely anticipated what it would feel like in practice. Vane's house was full when we arrived, not crowded, but populated with the particular density of a room where every person present had been selected and every selection meant something. I counted 11 guests across 2 connected rooms, identified 7 of them from the briefings, cross-referenced posture and proximity and the direction of small attentions the way Osiris had taught me, and arrived at a working social map before the first drink was poured. Vane himself was not what I expected. Shorter than the photograph suggested, with the expressive warmth of a man who had learned sociability as a professional instrument and deployed it fluently. He kissed my hand. Told me I was everything the rumors had undersold, which told me the photograph had indeed circulated and that he'd made it his business to have opinions ready. I smiled at him with every what I possessed and said the rumors were clearly working with insufficient material. He laughed. Beside me, Osiris's hand rested at the small of my back, lightly, the first time he'd touched me in a social context, and I was acutely, inconveniently aware of it for the entire duration of the introduction. We ate. The food was extraordinary and I tasted almost none of it, spending the first course building the character Osiris and I had constructed across 2 days of preparation, warmly indiscreet, socially confident, with the particular ease of a woman newly and privately deliriously happy, the kind that makes her slightly less guarded than she should be. Not drunk. Not yet. Just luminous in the way people are when they're in the early intoxicating phase of something they haven't yet had reason to doubt. I told a story about how Osiris and I had met that bore almost no resemblance to reality and was, I privately thought, considerably more romantic than the truth, and watched the table lean in with the helpless magnetism that stories about unexpected love always generate, and felt Osiris's hand find mine on the table with a naturalness that required no instruction and that I did not examine too closely. By the second course I had moved from luminous to warm. By the third I had introduced a glass of wine into my gestures as a prop, drinking less than I appeared to, a trick Mrs. Adiz had demonstrated with the quiet expertise of someone who had attended many evenings that required clarity behind a social performance. Vane's man was 2 seats to my right. Renner. From the briefings, 12 years in Vane's operation, access to scheduling and logistics, a recent pattern of expenses that didn't reconcile with his known income. I'd been watching him across the appetizers with the peripheral attention Osiris had trained into me, and what I found was a man performing relaxation with the same effortfulness I was performing warmth. We were both working. We were the only 2 people at the table who knew it. When Vane excused himself at the precise moment Osiris had predicted, standing call, first course, for minutes, I let my wine glass tip. Not fall. Tip, controlled, enough to send a small wave across the tablecloth and produce exactly the flutter of social embarrassment that makes everyone look at you and then, mercifully, look away. I laughed at myself. Touched Osiris's arm. Excused myself to find a bathroom. No one followed. The study was where the briefing had placed it. I found it in under 90 seconds, moving with the unhurried confidence of a slightly flushed woman looking for a powder room and not especially concerned about finding it quickly. The door was unlocked. Vane was a man who trusted his guest list, which was its own kind of useful information. I placed the device in 4 seconds. Underside of the desk drawer, prepositioned adhesive, exactly where Osiris's thumb had demonstrated on the briefing table that morning. My hands were steady. This surprised me. My heart was conducting something symphonic, but my hands had absorbed the lesson and were applying it without consultation. I was back in the corridor in 6 seconds. Renner was standing at the end of it. He looked at me. I looked at him. The corridor was quiet and the distance between us was approximately 10 feet and the study door was approximately 4 feet behind me. I had perhaps 2 seconds before the geography became a sentence. I widened my eyes in the particular way of someone who has been caught in mild private embarrassment rather than anything structural, and pressed a hand to my collarbone, and said, in the voice of a woman 2 glasses into a lovely evening, "Oh, thank God, I have been looking for a bathroom for an absolute age. This house is enormous. Is it left or right from here?" And ended it with a laugh that was slightly too bright and slightly too warm and absolutely the laugh of a woman who was exactly as unthreatening as she appeared. Renner looked at me for 1 second longer than comfortable. Then he pointed left. Said nothing. Watched me go. I found the bathroom. Ran cold water over my wrists for 30 seconds. Looked at my reflection and took 2 long breaths and then reconstructed the warmth and the brightness and the luminous ease and walked back into dinner as if the corridor had been nothing, as if my pulse wasn't still working through its aftermath, as if I hadn't just looked into the eyes of the man we were trying to catch and smiled at him like a woman without a secret in the world. Osiris glanced at me as I retook my seat. A fraction of a second. A question delivered in a look. I reached for my glass and let my fingers brush his briefly on the stem, and felt him still beside me and then settle, and hoped it read as affection and not as the only communication available to me in a room full of people who could not know what had just happened in a corridor off the east side of Castle Vane's beautiful, compromised house. Dessert arrived. I ate every bite. We didn't speak about the corridor until we were back at the house. The drive home had the particular quality of a held breath. Osiris beside me in the dark of the car, reviewing something on his phone with the focused economy of a man debriefing himself in real time, and me watching the city thin back into the private dark of the estate's approach road and letting the adrenaline of the evening metabolize slowly into something quieter and less easy to name. Renner had watched me leave the dinner. I'd felt it without looking. The kind of attention that doesn't announce itself but has a texture you learn to read when the cost of missing it is high enough. Whether he'd concluded anything useful was a question that lived, for now, in the device sitting under Castle Vane's desk drawer. Mrs. Adiz had left tea in the sitting room. She did this, anticipated endings, prepared for arrivals, with the seamless timing of someone who had long ago stopped distinguishing between care and precision. I poured 2 cups without asking and set one near Osiris's end of the low table and took the chair across from it, and we sat for a moment in the particular silence of 2 people who have shared something operational and are navigating the transition back to whatever passed for ordinary between them. Renner saw me, I said. Not a confession. Just a filing of facts, the way he taught me. I know. He was in the corridor for approximately 90 seconds before you appeared. He set his phone down. What did you do? I told him. The widened eyes, the lost bathroom, the laugh that was 2 degrees too bright. He listened without interrupting, which I'd learned was his version of close attention. And he accepted it, Osiris said. I think so. He watched me go. He didn't follow. No. He didn't. Something in his expression settled, not relief exactly, because I wasn't certain relief was in his vocabulary, but the fractional easing of attention that had been structural. You were very good tonight. The words landed differently than the tactical assessments I'd grown accustomed to across the week. Not adequate or correct or the impersonal good of a drill completed cleanly. This one carried weight. I held it for a moment and then set it down carefully, the way you set down something you're not yet sure you're allowed to keep. The tattoo, I said. He looked at me. I'd earned the non sequitur, 5 days of careful attention, of learning to read his silences and knowing which ones were walls and which were simply doors he hadn't opened yet. At Vane's dinner, one of the women across the table had asked about it, the ink climbing his throat, and he had redirected the question with such frictionless elegance that she'd thanked him for his answer before realizing she hadn't received one. But I had watched his hand move, briefly, barely, to the opposite wrist in the moment she asked. The same gesture he'd identified in me on the first day. A tell he didn't know he still carried. You don't have to, I said. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he'd chosen not to. Then he reached up and touched the edge of the ink at his throat with 2 fingers, not self-conscious, not performing the gesture, just acknowledging it the way you acknowledge a scar when someone has seen it, and pretending otherwise would cost more than it saved. I was 19, he said. My father's organization. I'd been brought in earlier than was wise, but wisdom wasn't the operating principle. He paused. Picked up the tea. Didn't drink it. There was a man named Dario. Older. My father trusted him completely, the way you trust the architecture of a building, not because you've tested it but because it's always been there. Dario had been there since before I was born. The sitting room was very still. Outside, somewhere in the grounds, something moved through the hedges, wind, or an animal, the quiet displacement of the dark. He was feeding information to a rival for 11 years, Osiris said. 11 years of sitting at my father's table, eating his food, speaking his name with what looked like loyalty. The organization survived what followed. My father did not. The tea cooled between his hands. The mark was my father's, he continued. His men wore it, here. He indicated the line of ink at his throat. After. I had it done after. Not to inherit what he was. To remember what trust costs when it's given without verification. A pause, precise and unflinching. Every man in my organization knows what it means when they see it. It isn't decorative. I sat with the weight of it. The 19-year-old boy who had learned, in the most irreversible way available, that loyalty was a thing you earned through evidence and never through tenure. Who had taken that lesson and built an entire architecture of controlled distance around it, the measured silences, the calibrated assessments, the way he stood in rooms as though already accounting for every exit. Not because he was cold. Because he had been taught, at 19, what warmth cost when it was extended without due diligence. You've been looking for a Dario ever since, I said quietly. He looked at me. Something in his face, old and unguarded and very briefly visible, the way a room is briefly visible when someone opens a door and then closes it, too fast for you to see everything but fast enough to know it was full. That's what the traitor is to you, I said. It isn't operational. It's personal. He didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. The confirmation was in the quality of his stillness, which had shifted from its usual deliberate composure into something that was simply still, the stillness of a thing that had stopped performing the management of itself for a moment and was just existing without armor. I understood, with the particular clarity that arrives sometimes without warning and cannot be unfound afterward, that Osiris Thorn was not a man who had chosen this world over other available worlds. He was a man who had been built inside it, who had learned its grammar before he'd learned the grammar of anywhere else, and who wore its mark on his throat not as a badge but as a reminder of the price of forgetting what it was. He was as trapped as I was. Just trapped longer. Just trapped so completely that the cage had become indistinguishable from the architecture of himself. I'm sorry about your father, I said. He looked at me for a moment. Not assessing. Not calculating. Just looking, the way people look when something simple and direct arrives in a space that has not had enough of it. Lumi. It was the first time he'd used my name without it being a closing. Without it being the punctuation on a conversation he was ending. It arrived differently, quieter, less structured, carrying something underneath it that neither of us was ready to pick up and examine in the light. I didn't push it. Didn't reach for it. Just let it exist in the space between us, in the cooling tea and the late hour and the particular honesty of a sitting room at midnight when the operational pretenses of the day have finally exhausted themselves. Get some sleep, I said. His words returned. The corner of his mouth moved. Just barely. Just once. The same movement I'd catalogued across 5 days and still hadn't successfully explained. He stood. Set down the tea. Paused at the door with his back to me for just a moment, not hesitating, not quite, but inhabiting the threshold the way you inhabit a decision before it becomes irrevocable. Then he walked through it. I sat alone in the sitting room for a long time after, and thought about 19-year-old boys who lose their fathers to betrayal, and marks worn as memory, and cages so old and well-constructed that the person inside them has long since stopped calling them cages. And thought about the fact that tomorrow was day 6. And that day 7 was the last day I was supposed to be here. The gala was at the Meridian. I knew this building, had photographed a product launch in its East Ballroom 18 months ago, back when I had clients and a career and a life organized around entirely different kinds of danger. The irony of returning to it in a borrowed sapphire gown with a listening device in my clutch and the name of a traitor sitting in my chest like a splinter was not lost on me. I filed it under the growing category of things I would find funny later, when later existed and was safe enough for humor. The device under Vane's desk had delivered 48 hours of audio, processed by men I never saw in a room I was never shown, had produced a name. Not Renner. Renner had been the distraction, the peripheral noise, the obvious suspect position to draw attention while the Real leak moved quietly in the opposite direction. The name that came back was Soren. 12 years with Osiris. Former military, structural access, present at every meeting that had been compromised in the last 6 weeks. A man Osiris had described, once, in passing, as reliable, using the word the way you use a word you have tested so many times it has become load-bearing. Osiris had received the name with a stillness so complete it was almost geological. Had said nothing for a long time. Then had said, quietly, that they would let it play out at the gala. That moving on Soren early would alert whoever was running him. That the cleanest resolution was to let the trap close around its own architect. What he hadn't told me, and what I understood only in retrospect, was that Soren already knew we knew. The ballroom was extraordinary, 200 people in formal wear under chandeliers that turned everything amber and cinematic, the hum of orchestrated sociality at full volume, the smell of wealth and flowers and the particular electric charge of a room where significant things were being quietly decided beneath the performance of celebration. I worked it the way I'd been trained, mapping exits, reading proximities, tracking Soren's position with the peripheral precision of someone who had spent a week learning that the most important things in a room are rarely what the room wants you to look at. Soren was good. I'll give him that. He moved through the evening with the unhurried ease of a man who had done nothing, who suspected nothing, who was simply present at a gala because presence was expected. He spoke to the right people. Laughed at the right moments. His attention, when it passed over me, registered nothing, no recognition of the device, no awareness of the name sitting in our possession. But he moved slightly too close to the east corridor at 40 minutes in. And the man he exchanged 4 words with near the champagne station was not a guest I had been briefed on. I found Osiris between the first and second courses, his hand finding the small of my back with the now familiar ease of a gesture that had begun as performance and had accumulated, across the week, a weight I no longer knew how to categorize accurately. Unbriefed contact, I murmured. Champagne station. Gray suit, no tie. Soren spoke to him at 43 minutes. His hand stilled against my back. Description. I gave it. 6 words, precise. He absorbed it without reaction, said something warm and entirely fictional to the couple beside us, and excused us both with the seamless social grace I had watched him deploy across a week and still couldn't fully reverse engineer. We were halfway to the corridor when the lights went out. Not a flicker. Not a gradual dimming. A complete, instantaneous severance, the chandeliers, the wall sconces, the ambient glow of the catering stations, all of it gone simultaneously in a way that was not a power failure but a decision. The ballroom erupted into the specific chaos of 200 people in darkness, chairs scraping, glass breaking, voices pitching upward into the register of genuine alarm. Osiris's hand found my wrist in the dark. Grip firm, immediate, the grip of someone who had prepared for this specific contingency even while hoping it wouldn't arrive. Stay close, he said. Not loud. Precisely loud enough. Then someone fired a shot from the direction of the east corridor and the chaos upgraded itself into something that didn't have a polite name. What happened in the next 90 seconds I can only account for in fragments: Osiris pulling me low and lateral, away from the corridor and toward the north wall where the service entrance was, the sound of his men responding in the dark with the coordinated speed of a protocol being executed, the particular acoustic signature of a room reorganizing itself around violence. I was not calm. I want to be accurate about that. My heart was doing something that had no business occurring inside a human chest, and the darkness was absolute, and the distance between the woman who had walked into a bar 12 days ago on a dare and the woman crouched against a ballroom wall in a sapphire gown was a distance I had not yet fully measured. But Osiris had been separated. I understood this when the hand on my wrist was replaced by a different hand, one of his men, Petra, who I knew from the house, and the voice near my ear was Petra's voice saying stay down, stay here, and not Osiris's voice. Where is he? I said. East corridor. There are 3 of them between him and us and our comms are jammed. Petra's voice was professional, which was the most frightening thing about it. We have men on the perimeter but they can't get a signal through. The interior team is dark. I had the secondary phone. The one Osiris had given me on the second day, the one I'd carried for a week and prayed I would never need, the one operating on a frequency offset from the primary communication network because Osiris Thorn prepared for things the way architects prepare for load, by building redundancy into structures before the weight arrives. I looked at it in my hand and thought about Soren, who had 12 years of access and knew every protocol and had apparently known about the primary network and had not known about this one because Osiris hadn't told him, because Osiris had told almost no one, because a man with a mark on his throat and a 19-year-old lesson carved into his operational DNA builds his redundancies quietly and keeps them close. He had given it to me. Of everyone available. I pulled up the contact. 3 letters. Typed the code word, Meridian East, 3 tangos, comms dark, move now, and sent it and watched the single delivery tick appear and did not breathe until it doubled. Received. 40 seconds. Then the sound from the east corridor changed, reorganized, reversed, the particular acoustic shift of a situation that has been interrupted mid-execution by a force it hadn't accounted for. Voices. Then silence. Then the emergency lighting bloomed on in long amber strips along the floor, turning the ballroom into something between a crisis and a painting. Osiris came through the east corridor entrance 90 seconds later. He was unhurt. Jacket gone, a cut along his jaw that was going to need attention, the particular compressed energy of a man who has just moved through something violent and is in the process of filing it away. His eyes found mine across the room with the immediate, unerring precision of someone who had known exactly where I was even in the dark. He crossed to me. Stopped close. Looked at me the way I had not yet been looked at by him, not assessing, not calibrating, not running the calculation of what I represented or what I cost. Just looking. Like I was the thing he'd needed to confirm existed. The message, he said. Received, I said. I know. I watched the tick. His hand came up and touched my face, jaw, briefly, the pad of his thumb at my cheekbone, and the touch had none of the instructional quality of the weapons lesson and none of the performed ease of the dinner table. It was simply what it was. Present, unguarded, arriving without prior calculation. Lumi, he said. And the way he said it this time contained everything the week had been building toward and no armor whatsoever. Around us, the ballroom reassembled itself in emergency lighting, and somewhere in the east corridor Soren was being dealt with in the manner of things that had been decided, and 200 people were finding their way back to the coordinates of their ordinary lives. I stood in the amber light with his hand at my face and understood that mine had already moved somewhere else entirely. They dealt with Soren quietly, the way this world dealt with everything that mattered. I wasn't told the details and didn't ask for them. There was a version of me from 13 days ago who would have pressed, who would have needed the information as a form of control, a way of mapping the edges of a situation she'd stumbled into without a guide. That version of me had been replaced, incrementally and without formal announcement, by someone who had learned that there were rooms in this world you didn't enter just because the door was visible, and that restraint wasn't the same as ignorance. What I knew was this: by the time we returned to the estate at 2 in the morning, the machinery had already moved. Calls made, positions shifted, the territorial dispute recalibrated around the absence of its primary information source. Osiris's world had absorbed the crisis with the practiced efficiency of a system that had been built to survive exactly this kind of pressure, and had survived it, and had already begun the quiet work of not letting the surviving show. The cut on his jaw needed 4 stitches. I watched Mrs. Adiz attend to it in the kitchen, him seated, jacket discarded, the same compressed patience he brought to everything, and felt the particular vertigo of a week's worth of accumulated context arriving all at once. The training, the dinner, the corridor, the tattoo, the darkness of the ballroom, and the amber emergency light, and his hand at my face with all its armor voluntarily absent. 13 days. I had known this man for 13 days. I went to bed and did not sleep. By morning the house had returned to its baseline, that particular register of quiet industry that I had come to read, across the week, as its version of peace. Breakfast appeared. The grounds were being attended to. The world continued its rotation with the serene indifference it maintained regardless of what happened beneath the level of its notice. Osiris found me in the East Wing sitting room at 9. He was wearing the dark shirt, sleeves rolled, the version of him that I had privately come to understand as the real one, the one that existed when the suit's concessions to the external world weren't required. He carried 2 cups of coffee, set one on the table beside me without ceremony, and remained standing in the way that meant what he had to say was going to be short, and he hadn't decided yet if he wanted to be seated for it. "The week is done," he said. "I know. The threat has been neutralized. Soren has been," a pause, brief and precise, "removed from the equation. The faction lost its source and, as of this morning, has indicated through intermediaries that it considers the matter closed." He looked at me steadily. "You fulfilled everything that was asked of you." "More than was asked." I held the coffee with both hands. Watched the steam rise and thin and disappear. "So I can go," I said. "Yes." The words sat in the room. Took up a surprising amount of space for a single syllable. "A car will take you wherever you need to go. The compensation we discussed has already been arranged, your account, untraceable, sufficient to cover the gap while you find your footing." He paused. "You'll have security for 30 days as a precaution. Unobtrusive. You won't notice them." "I'll notice them," I said. "You taught me to notice them." Something moved at the edge of his expression. "That movement." "Yes," he said. "I suppose I did." I set the coffee down and looked at my hands and thought about the 2-bedroom flat waiting for me, the updated CV sitting unsent in my drafts folder, the life that had been paused rather than ended on the night I'd put on a red dress and decided to be brave. It was all still there. It had continued existing in my absence with the loyalty of things that don't know they've been left behind. I thought about invisible. The word I'd used for myself in a bar 13 days ago with the bitter fluency of someone who had used it so often it had stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like a fact. I thought about the way he'd said my name in the ballroom's amber light. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Yes." "If I leave today," I stopped. "Reorganized." The terms were 1 week. 1 week and I go home and this is over. That was the agreement. It was. You're a man who honors agreements. Without exception. "So if I leave today," I said, "that's the end of it. The car and the account and 30 days of invisible security and then nothing. I go back to being a person you processed through a crisis and compensated accordingly." He was quiet for a moment. The quality of the quiet was different from the ones I had catalogued across 13 days. Not the deliberate architecture of a man controlling a room, not the loaded silence of someone withholding. This one was unmanaged. This one was simply him, standing in a morning room with 2 cups of coffee, not performing anything. That would be the clean version, he said. Yes. And the unclean version. He looked at me directly. Lumi. Don't, I said. Don't redirect it. I've watched you redirect things all week and I know what it looks like and I'm asking you not to do it right now. A long pause. Longer than most. The kind he didn't use often because he was a man who had disciplined himself out of needing them. The unclean version, he said, is that you are the first person to walk into my world from outside it who has not been diminished by the entry. Who has not required the world to be smaller or simpler to accommodate them. Who has sat across from what I am without flinching into either fear or performance. He paused. And I am aware that this is not a thing I am entitled to factor into a conversation about your freedom to leave. I stood up. He watched me, and for the first time in 13 days I saw something in his face that was not managed, not the fractional almost amusement, not the calibrated assessment, not the brief unguarded moment quickly shuttered. Just a man standing very still while a decision was being made that he had no mechanism for controlling, and finding, against all his operational instincts, that he had not prepared a contingency for how much that cost him. I crossed the room and stood in front of him and looked up at the mark on his throat and then at his face, and said, I don't want to be invisible to you. Something broke open in his expression. Quietly. Irreversibly. His hand found my jaw, the same gesture from the ballroom, the same complete absence of calculation, and this time it didn't depart. This time it stayed, and he looked at me the way you look at something you have been careful about for a very long time and have finally decided, with full accounting of the cost, to stop being careful about. This world, he said. You understand what it is. I've had 13 days of intensive instruction. It doesn't get simpler. I know. It doesn't become safe. I know that too. I held his gaze. But I spent 30 years being safe and I was invisible for most of them. I walked into a bar and said something reckless to the most dangerous man in the room and the world cracked open. I paused. I find I'm not particularly interested in watching it close again. He was quiet for a long moment. The house breathed around us. Somewhere outside, the gardener moved unhurried between the hedges, and the fountain ran, and the morning held itself in the particular suspension of things on the edge of becoming something they hadn't been before. You should know, he said quietly, that I don't do anything without full commitment to the outcome. I know, I said. You're very thorough. The corner of his mouth moved. And this time it didn't stop at the corner. This time it completed itself, slow, unguarded, transforming his face into something I hadn't seen across all 13 days and realized, only now, I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting. He smiled. And I understood, standing in the morning light of a house that had started as a cage and become something I didn't have a word for yet, that the most dangerous thing Osiris Thorne had ever done to me had nothing to do with the dark of a ballroom or a name on a black card or a world built on calculated violence. It was this. Just this. And I walked toward it with both eyes open.